what is it about? I said, well, Hollywood is about Woodrow Wilson and Warren G. Harding. Their presidencies I studied, but it was a great deal about the silent days of the movies. One of the figures that runs through the last 2 or 3 novels is William Randolph Hearst, who was a very important figure. Not only did he invent tabloid journalism, but if there was no news, he would invent it. Which then puts the whole question, what is history, on the table. If the historian goes back to old newspapers to reconstruct an administration, and that's been faked, how's he to know? What is history? And the very end of the Golden Age, there's a whole meditation on the nature of history. Is anything real? So with Hollywood, what I'm doing is I show the silent days, the movies, all of Chaplin and so on. It's kind of fun. But you also see the influence of, first of government, Woodrow Wilson on Hollywood at the time of the First World War. He sent a guy called George Creel out there, and George Creel was to organize propaganda movies, The Huns from Hell, stuff like that. And they did a lot of propaganda. Wilson appeared in at least 2 movies as himself, with great sententious thoughts. And suddenly Washington realized the importance of Hollywood. And Hollywood realized that Washington was a very interesting partner. They talk today about Hollywood and, as though this was something new and bizarre. Well, it's been going on since 1914, that symbiosis. Then I go into Woodrow Wilson, the First War, the disaster of the League of Nations, and Warren Harding, who was probably our nicest president. He really was a very good man, surrounded by very corrupt people.
Next call, Yonkers, New York.
Yes, hello. Thanks for having me on the air. I wanted to ask Mr. Vidal if you could talk a little bit about the actual process that you have to turn materials that you have acquired in your historical novels and transform them into a narrative form. The actual process by which you compile the bulk of the research material that you gather and transform it and put it into a creative narrative novel format.
It's a matter of reading, and I read. I'll read 100, 200, 300 books. Sometimes before I will start, I have to own the book so I can write in the margins. And as you read, you begin to see relationships between people. That helps you with your characters. Then you begin to find things that have been omitted in the official histories. And you begin to wonder why. Why has it been left out? Why is General Smedley Butler forgotten when he made such a startling, gave such a startling worldview of our activities? It's a matter of taking a lot of notes. I was helped in this series because I'm working with one family. So I know them, and now I start with one generation, second generation, third generation. I think I've got 4 generations in there. So I'm at home with the family. I know, and they're the fictional ones. The real ones are all interrelated, which is a curious thing that I found doing American history, that it's a very small deck of cards that governs the United States. Occasionally a new card is added, and some old cards are thrown out, but it's always pretty limited, the players. And you see how from administration to administration, there they are for the first 40 years of our history, 50 years. It was pretty much Virginians, all of whom knew each other, except for the 2 Adamses who came in and each got to heave-ho from the Virginians. They didn't want anybody from Boston in the White House. You begin to see these patterns. And of course the reading, I have the luxury of taking all the best stuff from other historians. I just lift it and transform it, and then I put my fictional characters together with the real people. And the reason for the fictional characters is that they can observe and have opinions, which I as author must not. And I can't pretend that I know what goes on in Abraham Lincoln's mind, but I can tell you what one of my invented characters thinks of him. And if there's a contradiction in Lincoln, I can have another invented character. No, I don't think that's what he meant at all. So this gives me the luxury to comment on what I'm doing. And then the historical novel, as I practice it, is essentially it's history. It's like a libretto, and the fictional characters are the music. So you might say, in a sense, these are sort of operas, that the music starts, and these are the fictional characters. And then we go through the familiar story. Abraham Lincoln goes to Ford Theater. And we know the plot, as we always know the plot of Julius Caesar or Aida. And then we have the fictional characters observing what happens with pity or with awe.
When you speak of the small deck of cards, in fact, you are an example of the interconnectedness of the power in America.
Oh, my heavens, yes. Well, a lot of that is because my mother's family, the Gores, were Anglo-Irish from County Donegal who came over in the 17th century. Well, those of us in the South who came from the British Isles in the 17th, 18th centuries, I think we're all related. There are so few of us, that we intermarried. Not only, I've never said it until now, I don't think, that in addition to the Gore family and my cousinage with Albert Jr., oh God, I tremble to think that I'm going to say this. I get a lot of mail, from people who are relatives, particularly from the South, because they know everybody's connections. I am a fifth cousin, twice removed. I don't know what twice removed means, except I think by election and defeat maybe is what is meant, of Jimmy Carter. Now you know it. You know the worst. Jimmy Carter. He had a grandmother, I think, who was a K from South Carolina. And my grandmother, who really raised me, Mrs. T.P. Gore, was born Nina K. from a South Carolina family. And I'm told that Carter was a favorite relative. Carter was the K, and she was certainly my favorite one.
So, Kennedy administration, Jackie.
She and I had the same stepfather.
Jimmy
Hugh
Carter.
Auchincloss, we finished with Hugh Auchincloss, who was descended on his mother's side from an uncle of Aaron Burr. And he had a painting of Theodosia. Rather, his friend of his had a painting of Theodosia that I used to look at when I was a child. That's the daughter by Burr.
Next call's from San Diego.
Yes, hello, Mr. Vidal. I would have to say that I hadn't really heard too much of your speaking. I'd been aware of your sort of stature in the literature community. And as a child of the baby boomers, and as a product of the psychologically inadequate education that we have, unfortunately, I was just totally surprised by the shocking clarity at which you've been sort of explaining the history of the age of imperialism in the 20th century and whatnot. And I just had a quick question regarding the relationship of William Jennings Bryan that you were speaking of earlier, and the sort of how he was supported by the Greenbackers, which were linked to Lincoln's Greenback policy and that sort of idealism. And also when Woodrow Wilson, William Jennings Bryan ran last, I think in 1908, and that Woodrow Wilson, of course, in 12, and he, of course, won the election. And how Wilson, the Democratic Party that was sort of manipulated by Wall Street, when they passed the Federal Reserve, how that sort of went against everything that William Jennings Bryan thought. And perhaps in a lust for wanted victory, it seems as if the Democratic Party in 1912 sold themselves out like the Republicans did after the post-Civil War era. And
Thanks.
so,
well, a lot to work with there. Thank you for the call.
Well, that's very well said. He's quite right. The Democratic Party then became part of the corporate party along with the Republican Party, and it was Wilson's election that did it. Wilson himself might not have gone that line, but Wilson fell for imperialism. Wilson was very divided about World War II, and that's where he and my grandfather parted. My grandfather had helped elect him. In fact, he was in charge of the 1912 campaign out of Chicago. And they didn't get on, but Wilson did say, not to him, but somebody else rather wistfully, he said, I wanted to be a domestic president, and here I am a war president. And he was in favor of the war. But But he said, I know at the end of this war, those great entities that I have fought, the trusts and the banks, will own the United States when this war is over, which is pretty much what happened. Apropos of the caller from San Diego on William Jennings Bryan, Bryan demonstrated his anti-imperialism when Wilson got us into the war. Bryan was his Secretary of State, and Bryan resigned. I have not known any man of state ever to resign a post so high because of a disagreement over policy. But the populace, and the true Americans, I like to think of it, did not want foreign wars. They saw no point. Why on earth should we be disturbed by the Kaiser? So he wanted to have a fight with France. Let him have a fight with France. It's none of our business. And he's thought to be a buffoon, Bryan, because of the monkey trial in Tennessee. He was no fool. He was a man of principle. He had a great speech. He explained in his last speech at a convention, he said, no matter my faults, as a man and as a politician, I have kept the faith.
In these many events over these years of American history that you've chronicled, is there one that you really wish you could have been at in person?
No. First of all, if I'm in a time machine, I don't want to go anywhere where there's no anesthetic. Just forget it. I think we would be very uncomfortable in any of those past places. The one volume I would like to have written that I didn't, and it's now far too late because I can't do this sort of research anymore, but I missed out on the Mexican War. I really should have done Henry Clay and Franklin Pierce, who's a fascinating president. The most overtly, nakedly ambitious. He picks a war with Mexico in order to grab California and the whole southwest of the United States. That's the fascinating time. And Lincoln was a young politician, opposed to the war, but then went along with it. And out of it came, of course, Jefferson Davis and Ulysses Grant, who was probably our greatest prose writer. His memoirs are a masterpiece.
Wrote them penniless, isn't that right?
Dying of cancer. He'd lost all of his money in one of the crashes that Wall Street prepared. Every cent was gone. And he was leaving Julia, his wife, with no money. So he makes a deal with Mark Twain, who was also a publisher, who paid him an enormous advance. And as he died, I think he finished the book one day, got the money for his wife the next, and died.
Was it popular at the time?
Oh, yes. It's in 2 volumes. And in due course, it was disdained by literary people because he was known to have been a pretty bad president, but he was a very great general. What nobody knew, and it was Gertrude Stein, I think, first pointed it out, that he wrote the best American prose. I mean, we've had grander writers like Henry James, but for the plain style, it was perfect. That was what West Point did. You had to be clear when you sent an order, send the 2nd Battalion to such and such a hill. You had to be precise. You couldn't be windy. And it's beautifully tight, austere. Rather like Julius Caesar's, except Caesar's too self-serving. Caesar is nothing but trying to convince you. It was Montaigne said about how maddening Caesar is, and he writes about his doings in the Gallic Wars. We all want to know how he was such a great general, and all he wants to do is convince us what a great engineer he was. He wastes pages after pages on how he built a bridge over a river. Grant doesn't do that. He stays with the subject.
Philadelphia next.
Hello. It's a great pleasure for me. I'm a great admirer of your works, Mr. Vidal, and of you personally. I would like to speak about Lincoln. You have aptly said that he is the tragic figure of American political history. I wonder if you could expand on your opinion of the impact of his personality, both as a president and as an American icon, in the context of your broader themes of empire and militarism. And secondly, someplace else you referred to the American Civil War as our Peloponnesian War, which I think is really a very brilliant analogy, and I wish you could expand on that. Again, it was a great pleasure to hear you. Thank you.
Well, Lincoln is the most mysterious of the presidents, and there is an air, there's a kind of megalomania about him. When he was 29, and he was a legislator in Springfield, he gave a speech to the Young Men's Lyceum, I think it was called. And it was really on power and presidential power. And I don't know it by heart. I can give you a little bit of paraphrase that he said about the man of great ambition will not be content